Welcome back to the Innovative Accountant Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Coakwell, and we have an exciting podcast for you today that I've been waiting to do for quite some time now. Today's podcast will focus on the future of the accounting profession. Change is the new normal, and disruption seems to be the theme these days. We see it everywhere, whether it's in the global economy, the way we interact and work with one another, our environments that we live in these days, remote work environments, working from home. There's so much disruption and change going on, and the CPA profession is no exception. In the last few decades, we've seen changes within the profession that have necessitated the development of new skills, new technologies, and the adoption of new ideas. The big questions we need to ask ourselves are, when we look to the future of accounting, what does the profession look like? How will accounting jobs and careers change? And what do we need to do as a profession to adapt in these changing times? Today, we're going to focus on the Foresight Initiative from CPACanada that they created to tackle these important questions and set a new strategic direction for the accounting profession. We will also discuss how this initiative is changing the competency training for future CPAs. We have the perfect guest today to learn more about how our profession is staying ahead of these changes. Joining me from Waterloo, Ontario is Tim Jackson. Tim is the chair of the Competency Map Task Force, which is responsible for the creation of CPACanada's new Competency Map, a document that lays the foundation for the CPA certification program, including education, accreditation, examination, and experience requirements. Welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Well, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Tim, you started your accounting career with Coopers & Lybrand. And we're going to start there. You started that in the early 90s, a similar time frame as I was at KPMG. And in less than 20 years, you were awarded your FCA. And I find that remarkable. I know I have a father that was a chartered accountant. He spent his entire career getting there. And I know the level of work that he put into his community and the profession to get there. For somebody to do that in 20 years is incredible. Clearly, you have a lot of passion for the profession. Let's start there. Where did that passion come from? How did you start down the path of being an accountant?
Yeah, I sort of almost backed into it in high school. I knew I wanted to go into business after high school, and I'd done well in my accounting courses, so I thought, well, I'll apply to some accounting schools. And then just decided that, rather than go general business, I'd done well in accounting, let's go. I went to the University of Waterloo and enrolled in the co-op program. And I've been very lucky. I worked a high school co-op with a really small accounting firm. It was an accounting firm in Oakville. We only had one audit client. That's how small the firm was. It was lots of small businesses, a lot of T1s. And then I actually did my co-op with that firm all the way through university. And it really, what I loved about it was different clients every day. And we saw all these different types of businesses, different types of entrepreneurs. And then when I graduated, I thought I'd better go to a real firm to get training for the UFE. And I went to Coopers & Lybrand. And, things just happen that are, they're fortunate and a bit of dumb luck. I showed up on the first day downtown Toronto expecting to be thrown onto a bank audit. And they said, would you mind getting on the subway and going up to our office in North York, our owner-managed business group? They're short somebody, and you've done a little bit at a smaller firm. So I went up there and didn't leave. I spent, it only ended up being a year and a bit, but I was supposed to be up there for 2 weeks. I said, can I stay? And so it was this idea of, again, smaller clients than the big corporates is where, and I think it all went back to that small firm in Oakville that took me when I was a high school student and said, okay, we're prepared to give you a shot in this profession.
Yeah, fantastic. It's, you mentioned the opportunity to experience change and different clients all the time. And obviously you've segued that into a lot of your career, because everything we're going to talk about today is change in the future and how adaptable people are. And lots of people in the accounting profession that maybe didn't like that change, right? That they wanted to stick on one file and one type of a client. But not unexpected in those firms. You sort of segued that experience with Coopers into a really successful entrepreneurial business nonprofit career. So some of the things you've done, serving as CEO of the Accelerator Center, which was an incubator for technology startups, VP at the University of Waterloo, executive VP at the Mars Discovery District, which was one of the world's largest urban innovation hubs, co-founding Tech Capital Partners, or early stage venture capital, CFO, CEO at Waterloo Pickstream, which I think eventually sold to Cisco. And then today, President and CEO at Shad Canada, which is very, very cool. You know, creating this entrepreneurship program for high school students and really educating in a different way the talent of the future. So very, very interesting career. Why don't you share a little bit about your career and some of these milestones and how the accounting background, I guess, helped you succeed?
Yeah, I think the accounting background was the root in everything. I passed the UFE and then decided I want to get out of public accounting, and the reason for that was I want to deal with the future instead of historical numbers. And as you know, most of the work is historical numbers. And I looked around the firm, but ultimately I got very lucky. I was on an account. It was a lawn care company that had just been acquired, and the CFO for this company was First Service Corporation, which is now a multi-billion-dollar company. At the time, really only had two employees, Jay Hennick, who was the founder, and a gentleman who was the CFO. And the CFO was in our office at Coopers & Lybrand, in the Mississauga office, which is very unusual, as you know, for the client to be there. And I said to him, "Why are you here?" And he said, "Because my boss says we need these financial statements done." And I think it was February. And the next morning he came in and he said, "Tim, your car's covered in snow. Did you go home last night?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "You said your boss needed these statements done, so I just stayed here to get them done." And he said, "You have to meet my boss." And I met Jay Hennick, and it changed my whole career. Jay was the founder of First Service, which was a business that was ultimately buying controlling interest in different types of recurring revenue companies, lawn care, property management, security. So I joined Jay, and at the time David Rogers, who was the CFO. There were the three of us. I joined to do consolidations. A few months later, we went public. I didn't even know what going public was, but I was negotiating with the OSC, and then we went public on NASDAQ as well. And then Jay very quickly moved me into doing acquisitions, and he would hold my hand through the first couple and then got to the point where I was doing them on my own. And I did about 35 acquisitions.
Wow.
And what was great about that is I met 35 different sets of entrepreneurs and saw different ways that they ran their business, and everyone did something different. And I was having a great time, was there with Jay for 5 years, and friends of mine had started a technology business in Waterloo. They were just about to close some seed financing from a venture capital firm, and they said to me, "Tim, will you come and join us to build this business?" And for me, it was this opportunity to say, we can now build a business from scratch, and I can look at all these 35 companies and 35 sets of entrepreneurs, and what if we took the best of each one and built that into our business? And we were quite lucky. That was the Pickstream that you mentioned. We started off with 4 of us. We grew it to a couple hundred people and sold it to Cisco. And we were right place, right time, no question. But it was a sense of I learned from all these other entrepreneurs. That led to me being able to set up a venture capital firm in Waterloo doing early stage technology investing. So now investing in entrepreneurs and trying to take everything that I had seen and help them grow their business. The best thing about being a venture capitalist, or one of the best things, is you are your own boss. And that's when I got very involved in the community, because my time was mine. And so I thought it was important to give back to the community, and got involved with things like the food bank and the Center in the Square Theater and the library. And ultimately the Accelerator Center, which is, as you mentioned, is an incubator, and I had the opportunity to go there. And then that sort of was my progression from the for-profit sector into the quasi-nonprofit, but still helping entrepreneurs. And ultimately that progressed through the University of Waterloo to Mars, and today where I'm running a charity, Shad Canada, but I'm taking a business approach to it. And so every part of my journey, my background as a CPA and my background as an accountant, I think has been massively helpful. And so, you mentioned the profession and the impact. I'm very grateful for having, gone through that CPA route, and then ultimately using what I learned to, every day I'm using things that I think are a part of me is a CPA in me that's helping me make decisions about young people and entrepreneurs.
I love that. I love that entrepreneurial spirit, and how that started with that initial mentor, and you kind of learned the ropes, and then you channeled that into your own way. And I especially like how you've now, lots of people, they have success, they can keep building their empires, right? And you've sort of channeled that into a very unique way with Shad. Let's talk a bit about that. Like, What are you doing with Shad? It's such a unique thing that you're doing.
Yeah, Shad has been around for 40 years, and it's a program for high school students. It's the students who have just finished grade 10 or grade 11, and they go away for the month of July, and they live on campus at one of 20 universities. And over the course of the month, they get exposed to STEAM plus entrepreneurship. So they're seeing lectures from university faculty, they're doing hands-on workshops, and they're given a problem to solve. We call it the design challenge. And over the course of the month, they go from a massive problem such as, how might we help Canadians treat fresh water with more respect, to building a solution to that problem, essentially building a business. And it's life-changing for the participants, which is what as I was going through my due diligence to say, was I interested in this role? That's what really struck me, was I would meet people every room I was in when I was trying to decide whether to put my name forward. I would mention Shad, and someone would say, "Oh, went to Shad, changed my life," or "My daughter went to Shad, was transformational." And so I've sort of taken that business approach to say, we have this incredible platform. We have a problem because we have too many applicants for the number of spaces we have. We're at 20 universities, around 1,100 spaces. So what do you do to innovate? We spent 2 years during COVID running the program online. Well, starting next summer, we will leverage what we learned during COVID and do our normal back to campus program, but also offer an online version, which you can obviously scale. There's a whole bunch of people for different reasons can't be away from home for the month of July. Could be they've got to take care of younger siblings. They might have a part-time job. They could be doing athletics. Could be for religious reasons. They can't be away overnight. And so it's things like that, saying, how do you take this 40-year-old platform that is having a meaningful impact and expand it? So we're doing things like week-long programs and just experimenting. The same way we would expect an entrepreneur to experiment. We were in Nunavut in September running a four-day program for Inuit youth, for example. So just doing things like that to say, let's take the model and roll it out to other communities.
Very cool. And so are you across the country now? And now that you're online, are you able, obviously you're able to impact?
We're coast to coast to coast. We have programs in 9 of the 10 provinces. We'll be in the territories shortly. There's a university up there that's just waiting to build residences. So yeah, we are literally have 20 institutions coast to coast.
Very cool. Well, good for you. The organization's in good hands. I want to talk about, you mentioned some of the community things. Obviously, Shad's a big part of that. You've got way too many to list. I'm very impressed with everything you've done to give back, and some of the awards that you've won in the process, like winning the Caring Canadian Award, which was issued by the Governor General of Canada. I mean, wow, that's pretty outstanding. On that award, recognizing individuals who volunteer their time to help others and to build a smarter and more caring nation. I love that. And the fact that you won that just speaks volumes about you and your commitment. All of the things that you've done, you put in countless hours into this. What do you feel the biggest sense of pride from and accomplishment from?
I think it's the empowering the executive directors and CEOs who are running those nonprofit and charitable organizations. And I think folks like you and I and members of the profession, I think we have a bit of an obligation to support them. If you think about in my community, Waterloo or Ontario, where I've been involved with some things, the people running our nonprofits and our large charities are just as talented as the people running for-profit entities. But they've made a decision to go and do it within a nonprofit or charitable sector. And so I think we need to be encouraging them, and I think we need to be supporting them and allowing them to be entrepreneurial within the roles that they have. And, to answer your specific question, I think if I think about all the things I've been involved with, the one I'm most proud of was a project by the region of Waterloo Food Bank. The Food Bank in Waterloo region provides food to about 60 agencies. But the executive director at the time, when I was involved, said there was an abundance of food manufacturers between Waterloo and Windsor along the 401 corridor. And in conversations with those food manufacturers, they had an awful lot of waste. And it was either being sold to farmers to feed pigs, or it was going to landfill. And so she embarked on put a business plan together, say, what if we could get that food and distribute it throughout southwestern Ontario? And so she pulled together a business plan, needed a little bit of seed funding, which we got from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And she put together this project, and in the first 3 years, which was the trial, 8 million pounds of food was collected from those food manufacturers and distributed to food banks from Windsor to Niagara to Owen Sound. Well, that model then got replicated throughout the rest of the province and is now being replicated in other parts of the country. And so I tell that story often. Wendy's her name, Wendy Campbell. And I will say, Wendy did all this. And she will, if we're speaking on a panel together, she will say, yeah, except there was a whole bunch of hiccups. And that she had a board that said, why would we treat this any different than if it was a venture capitalist investing in a tech entrepreneur? Knowing there's going to be hiccups along the way, knowing it's not going to be perfect, but focusing on the end game. And I think that's the stuff that I am most proud of, is being able to say to these what I view as entrepreneurs who are dealing with some of society's biggest problems and saying, go take an entrepreneurial approach. It doesn't have to be perfect. We know you're going to make mistakes and have to innovate and iterate. And so why would it be any different than in the for-profit sector? So, and I hope as a profession, more of us can be doing that and encouraging folks to stay and support these agencies and nonprofits, because they've chosen to do that instead of going into the for-profit sector.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great share. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's the key with entrepreneurs, right? It's that ability to get comfortable with failure and fail forward and learn and know that there's going to be these challenges and you're still going to move through them and forward. Yeah. So
and learning from it. You don't. I mean, I always say you don't tolerate incompetence, but you have to accept that failing is a part of learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. Well, that's fantastic. I love having you as a guest on today. We're going to now sort of segue in. I want to talk about really the theme of today, which is this disruption, this change, what the profession needs to do about it to continue to be relevant. And I want to start with the Foresight Initiative. And my understanding is that was launched by CPACanada. They put a task force together. I think that was in 2018. Talk a little bit about your experience with that. I believe you were maybe involved in a subset of that, but just walk through for our listeners what the Foresight Initiative was, kind of how it came about, and why it's important.
Yeah, I think Foresight was a recognition by the accounting profession, CPACanada, the provinces and territories, that the world is changing, and that as accountants we need to change along with it. And it's a recognition that when you think about the profession, you define that very broadly. And so the group that I was specifically involved with, which is the Competency Map Task Force, which I know we're going to talk about, is a piece of that, which is what does a new CPA need to know to become a CPA? But I think you have to then drop that in a bigger context, which is, so what are the post-secondary institutions teaching? What are the firms, if you're going to a firm, doing? What are individual CPAs doing around lifelong learning? And so I think Foresight broadly says there's some data that is somewhat troubling for accountants, that says some of the things that we've traditionally done are becoming less and less relevant or are being automated. And so if we want to remain relevant, we need to adapt and change. I think that's, broadly speaking, that's what Foresight was looking to tackle.
Okay. And your perspective on that, like that was 2018. Here we are, I guess, 4 years later, 5 years later. What's your view on how that's been received by the profession? Are they aware of it? Like when you talk to other accountants and you travel, do you feel the profession is aware that there is a bit of a roadmap and a task force that's been put together to solve some of these challenges?
I expect that most CPAs in Canada aren't aware that there's stuff going, or they may have seen something and aren't into the weeds. And I was to some extent one of them. I feel a great obligation to give back to the profession in the sense that for me, the CPA, as we've mentioned, is the grounding. Chairing this task force was the first time I'd done something very specific for CPACanada, or for in my case CPA Ontario, and so I think that's one of the challenges, is that we are so broad in terms of we have CPAs that range from students who've just registered in the program to folks that are effectively late in their career. And how do you touch everybody? Certainly when our piece, for example, the Competency Map Task Force, one of the things that we identified was it was going to be critical to get in front of as many people as possible and get to as many stakeholders. And so we were very deliberate about that, and happy to unpack that a little bit more. And I think that's one of the things that Foresight is trying to deal with is how do we make members of the profession aware that this is going on, and probably more importantly, that it's relevant to them. That people are just in their jobs, doing their work, perhaps not fully recognizing that the world is changing. And some people will be fine, but I think for the most part, the profession needs to adapt, needs to think about what's going on in the world, and so that there has to be the right communication campaigns. There has to be the right ways for folks to interact with Foresight and its different initiatives. And I think the profession is trying to do that. The CPACanada, the provinces are thinking about how do we get more people aware of this, both as a member of the profession, but I think it's also important, the second piece, which is that the public is aware that we're changing and we're transforming as a profession. And I'm not an expert, and I don't have the authority or the information to speak about it, but I think you'll start to see the profession talk about this. How do we get into public discourse more? How do we have some of our leaders at the institutes talking about how the profession is changing, so the general member of the public knows that we're adapting as a profession.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And we're going to come back to the Competency Task Force that you chaired, and I'm assuming a lot of this Foresight, the things that came out of Foresight were influential, at least in terms of how you started to lay out that competency map for future CPAs. But let's talk a little bit about what were the key challenges. So we talked about disruption of the profession. What were the key challenges or dangers to the profession that were sort of what came out of that Foresight effort?
Yeah, so we in our group, we looked, for example, at World Economic Forum data. And the World Economic Forum publishes these lists of the emerging jobs and the jobs that are declining. And I think it's quite worrisome for us as a profession. Auditors, bookkeepers are on the list of jobs that are going away, and the jobs that won't exist in the future. In the top 5 jobs, auditors, bookkeepers are in there, and we're the most recent set of data, which were actually those jobs are going away faster than they were 5 years ago. The jobs that are increasing are a lot of things around data and how do you analyze data and the like. So the bad news is that some of our traditional roles are going to go away, but there's a huge opportunity. I mean, at the end of the day, as accountants, we've been dealing with data since the profession was created. But I think what we need to get more comfortable with now is that the type of data may change. So it might not always be the traditional financial statement data, but at the end of the day, as a profession, we are good at auditing, ordering, analyzing data. It happens to have traditionally been financial statement data, but I think we are well positioned then to take advantage of this emerging, the emerging jobs. But you then have to say, so what does that mean for the post-secondary institutions? What does it mean for what we're teaching? One of the accounting firms was very clear with us that they are sending new graduates to a program to upskill their data analytics capabilities, because they just didn't feel that the students graduating broadly from most institutions had the right data analytics capabilities they needed to be relevant for the work the firm was seeing. And so I think that will evolve, where we will that will trickle down to the post-secondary institutions, for example. So it's not as if the profession has not done anything. So I clearly don't want to leave that sense.
Right.
But I think it's also some of these external data points are a bit of a wake-up call for us that the folks that are graduating today, their job as CPAs is going to look very different than it did when you and I went through, for example.
Right. Yeah, every company you talk to is trying to figure out how to capture more data in a more digital way, how to make it useful, how to use artificial intelligence to sort of leverage that data and change. And obviously the accounting profession has a huge opportunity to do that.
Yeah. And COVID, I mean, one of the silver linings of COVID is the way accounting firms and audit firms and practices changed. I don't know, about, all of the typical listeners you have, but you think about how some of the large firms suddenly adapted. I sit on the board of a bank. During COVID, though, our bank audits were done 100% remotely by our audit firm. Would have been unheard of. We go back to my story about starting. My classmates that started downtown Toronto just did, would do a bank rec effectively for their entire work term and sit inside one of the big banks in a small cubicle. And so I think that the profession is adapting and changing, and that sense of, okay, I can now do a remote audit. I can now do an audit using analytic tools to decide how am I going to pick my sample? Am I going to actually sample, or am I just going to use AI to effectively look at every transaction? I mean, these days you don't even have to sample. You can just run the entire GL and all the transactions through AI, and it effectively is looking at each one and picking out, oh, this one is inconsistent, so let's drill down more and more. And so I think anyone who's in the profession, whether they realize it or not, is actually already adapting how they analyze and how they look at data.
Right. And so that whole idea of, in the past, a lot of the data, it was about reporting the data. Yeah. And that sort of rear view mirror approach. Yes. And I found it interesting that CPACanada named this initiative the Foresight Initiative, because it makes sense, right? Because we're trying to go from maybe hindsight to foresight, and talk a little bit about that, because data is a big part of this, but how we've been trained to think and what our traditional role was is changing. And so talk about what that needs to look like today.
Well, and it goes back to my broad comment that I got out of the public accounting, because I was sick of dealing with historical information. I think the huge opportunity for us as a profession is the analyzing and then acting on data. And I was very open during some of the sessions we did in consultations, where I said, I think we need to see more CPAs in the C-suites of organizations, not just in the CFO role. But I think there's a sense of analyzing information, making decisions about moving forward, and thinking about strategic planning, strategic thinking, and being leaders in terms of the future. And it doesn't matter to me whether you're doing that in a business sense, whether you're doing that for a nonprofit, whether you're doing that in a public sense of being inside a government. It's this idea for me that I think as a profession, we will be judged as a success when we are in those different C-suite roles as accountants, and bringing what we understand about how to take a certain amount of information and then making a decision about it. And that's what, we've traditionally, that's what's made us accountants, as you said. It's often reporting on that data, but it's now, to me, the most important thing is the analyzing that data and then saying, what will I now do moving forward using that historical data? And so I like you, I think Foresight is a great name for the initiative, because it has all these different meanings. Yes, it's the future of the profession, but it's also thinking about that we as a profession are going to help organizations move forward.
Well, and I think that, that the real opportunity, there's lots of people that have opportunities to leverage that data and analyze it and use judgment to affect the future. But I think the opportunity is really the foundation that the profession has with ethics, the trust, the professionalism, and that comes back to a bit of that audit training and, how they look at things. And, that probably sets up a profession well to take advantage of that change and that opportunity. Would you agree with that?
No question. Yeah. That's what makes us accountants, right? We are, the public trusts us. We are regulated. We have in the provinces, we have exclusive rights to do certain things, and part of that is because of the ethical mindset that we have and the way we are trained. And so whatever we're doing, whether that is dealing with historical information, future information planning, it's all done in that context of, we act in the public interest, and we act with an ethical underpinning to the work we do. And that's what makes us CPAs versus someone who may have a business background but is not a profession or from a profession the way we are as CPAs.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And so we talk about some of these C-suite roles and things. Let's sort of segue that back. We've got a lot of public practice firm listeners in our community. And so what do you see there? Like in my travels, I feel the mindset is shifting. I've met through the integrated advisory community that I've been fortunate to be a part of building. I've had the opportunity to talk to hundreds of accountants, and 5 years ago, when I was having conversations, there wasn't a lot of appetite for change.
Yeah.
I think it seems the mindset is shifting, but I'm still very surprised at firms that still believe that traditional model is fine.
Yeah.
And so what's your take on that? Are you seeing the mindset shifting in the profession? Is that happening or isn't it?
I think it is. I mean, there's always going to be people on, different, the pendulum, if you say the pendulum's shifting or swinging, that people will be at different points on that. When we were going through our consultations, we spent a lot of time with all sorts of practitioners, and was interesting talking to folks like the listener group that you've just identified, who said more and more the traditional work, as in I'm opining on someone's financial statements, or I'm preparing their financial statements, or doing their T1, their T2, that's almost become you get it off the shelf. Anyone can do it, and that's not minimizing the work we're doing. But what we were hearing is, my clients want me to help them with the business. My clients are looking for me for broader business advice. So yes, they need the returns done, whether that's whatever level of assurance for my creditors or my bank or whatnot. Yes, I need my tax returns done. But I really want my accountant to be a partner in my business. And the other thing we were finding was, as they are trying to hire into the firms, that's what the CPA students want. That they want something that's more than just putting numbers into effectively a computer program and spitting it out. The automation of tax returns and the like is just going to continue. So it's not to suggest that we won't be relevant doing T1s and T2s, but we're not far away from, particularly on the personal side, where CRA basically says we have all the data. This is your T1.
Yeah.
I think it won't be long before you and I are sent our T1, and we just press a button and say, yeah, we'll process it as with that data. And so it's really that business partner is what I think people are looking for, and we've tried to, and I don't want to jump too far ahead on the map, but what we tried to do in terms of the competency map is recognize that and say that the advice we're giving has to be given in the context of the world in which we are doing our work. And so it goes beyond just understanding debits and credits. So having said that, I get that there are some firms that are struggling with that, and we did meet some practitioners who said, I just want to keep on doing what I'm doing. And they will probably run their business out to a certain point, but I think the ones that are growing their business are the ones where they are becoming partners with their clients and being viewed as much more than just opining on historical information.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, thinking of it as we're helping business owners, entrepreneurs start their business, plan their business, grow it, help them value it, help them position it for sale. And then ultimately, how do we handle, that's most people's, as entrepreneurs, their biggest asset of value. How do we help them manage that when they're done?
Right. And so exactly. That transition, that whether it's, do I have family that I can pass this on to? I didn't mean to sell it to somebody. I've just joined the board of an entity. We're being very quiet about it, but it's being put together to help entrepreneurs who don't have a succession plan, that want to exit their business but keep their business within a community. And part of that is a significant piece of our outreach will be to CPAs who are the trusted advisors for those clients that are trying to say, can you help me figure out what I do from a transition standpoint to monetize this asset that I've built?
Yeah, perfect. And how many of those opportunities are going to happen here in the next the next number of years? It's probably the biggest opportunity. But that's great. Let's segue a little bit back now to the your role as chair of the Competency Map Task Force. How did that come about? How did you get connected with CPA? And obviously, I can look at your background, understand why they chose you. But how did that start?
It came about through some work I'd been doing with the School of Accounting and Finance at the University of Waterloo, just helping them with some initiatives, including a student venture fund. And it was the director of that school that I think recommended me to CPA Ontario. And the way the task force was put together, it was put together by the national, all the different provinces. And the CPACanada and the provinces, I think, had done a great job populating the task force. Their academics, our members from public practice, folks working inside government, folks from big firms, small firms, and then I think in the sense of a chair, they were looking for someone that didn't have a preconceived notion about what the profession should look like going forward. And I think, came to me, I think partially because I wasn't from one of the big firms. I was an accountant who still valued my CPA designation, but was outside of the public practice. And I think it was a bit of a signal that they were serious about transformational change. The conversations I had before agreeing to this were, so tell me again what you want. And they in CPACanada and the provinces and territories were really clear that they wanted a new competency map drawn from scratch, blank page approach.
Okay, cool.
And I know we'll talk about the process and talk about this, the map, but we were given that mandate and they stuck to it. I was very concerned that as we went through, it was a 2-year process, that eventually someone was going to say, we know we told you that, but we really didn't mean it. Can you go back and just tweak the existing map? They didn't do that. So I think it was because of that type of background. And I give full credit to the provinces and CPACanada because they let us go from scratch, and happy to take you through the process.
So how did you, so you got appointed. How did you select? Did you select the team then?
No, the team was selected. It was done by the provinces. So the West got representation, British Columbia got representation, the East got representation, Ontario got representation. So it was done by each of the provinces had appointed somebody, but they did it in coordination. So they had so collectively, we were a broad subset. So there were about 8 of us on the task force, and a really good cross-section of CPAs in different roles across the country.
Perfect. And then, so once the task force was put together, how did you start? What did you do to start going through that?
So we spent the first year resisting the temptation to pick up a pen and write. Which is really tough because everyone had ideas. And so what we did was we said, let's spend the first year doing 2 things. One is doing research. So let's do a literature scan of what's out there. So we looked at competency maps from CPAs in other countries. We looked at other professions and their competency maps. We looked at things like the World Economic Forum data we referenced. And then we said, where are we missing data? And then let's commission our own data. And so we had some public forums. We had business leaders. We worked with some equivalent of market research firms. So we did that. The second thing we did, which I think was the most important, was we convened all sorts of meetings and roundtables, and we listened. We started off very early and realized that we needed to get the post-secondary institutions to buy into the process, and that we need to iterate throughout the entire time. So we pulled together a monthly discussion forum, predominantly with academics. There were about 100 of them across the country, and every month we would bring them a question. They would work in small groups, and they would give us feedback. COVID became a huge advantage because Irene Wyzek, who was the right hand, she's a member of the task force, but was also effectively the staff person involved and held the pen when we ultimately did the report. She was wonderful. She and I did literally hundreds of consultations, and they would range from speaking at a conference with 300 people to a group of 5 or 6 people. But we could do it because of COVID. She and I, there were some weeks we were doing as many as 12 or 14 sessions, and we could be in PEI 1 minute and then close up the Zoom call, get on another Zoom call, be in Saskatchewan the next minute. And so we literally spoke to thousands and thousands, thousands of people, and over the course of that first year, and it really helped us shape what did we want the map to look like. And then we started putting pen to paper, and the existing competency map is about 160 pages. It's 180 competencies. We said it's far too dense. It's far too prescriptive. We wanted to take an approach that was much less prescriptive, an approach that was evergreen, so it could be changed easily, reflected the world we live in. And we very early on came up with this idea of let's start with foundational principles and then build off that. So you have foundational principles and you go all the way to specific competencies. And along the way, we were meeting regularly with each of the provincial accounting institutes. We're meeting with CPACanada and just bringing them along. and
Perfect.
iterating, and the CEOs of the provincial bodies and the vice presidents of the provincial bodies were incredible supports. As I said, I kept thinking, they're going to say this is going too far, or it's not, it's too different. They didn't. We got it approved at the end of 2021, which is in hindsight, I had no idea. It's an incredible feat, because you basically have to get 12 different bodies to all agree on the same document. I mean, it's one of the things I've learned, as a CPA. I had no idea how our profession really worked. And that, so if one of them had said no, we'd have had to, sort it out. But we got it approved, and that report came out early in 2022, and now it's been passed on to another group who I argue has the real challenge, because now they have to implement it. So I sort of say it felt at the time that we were doing the incredible amount of work, but now we're able to say, okay, here it is. Good luck with this. Figure it out. But just to jump back, one of the things that was really key was this idea that it has to be evergreen and it has to change quickly. You referenced that Foresight started in 2018. This competency map, just that piece of it, to both do the map and then get it implemented for the post-secondary institution, is going to be a 4 to 5 year process. Mm-hmm. Well, we can't do that in 4 and 5 year chunks. We, as a profession, we have to be more nimble. And so part of what we've hoped with the new map, by being less prescriptive, is that it can be changed on the fly. It lets the post-secondary institutions be a bit more nimble. It lets them differentiate themselves. So happy to drill down more, but that at a high level, that's sort of what we did.
Yeah, no, that sounds very in-depth and a lot of work to pull that all together. You mentioned foundational principles.
Yeah.
So maybe just touch on that briefly on, what drove the end result here? What were those principles, and did they really change from what they were in the past?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things that changed, and I think it's how we think about them. So you at the end of the day, we sort of talk about what this common core and this ethical mindset that CPAs have to have. And then we say that, so throughout that, for example, is, ethics is ethical decision making is part of what we do. When you and I went through, and so we're, as you mentioned, we're relatively similar vintage. We memorized the Tax Act and we memorized the handbook. Mm-hmm. And so we said things like, we think it's important that a new CPA understand what a tax credit is. It's not important that they have memorized a list of tax credits that exist at a point in time. Because they're going to change constantly, but they need to know where to go, where to find those changes. We also they need to understand the basics of assurance and accounting standards, but again, recognizing that they will change from time to time. Also need to be able to explain things like accounting standards, assurance standards, and the like, but don't necessarily have to memorize the stuff that exists today. Another example I always give is consolidations. When I went through, I did 2 courses in consolidations as an undergrad. Well, today you push a button and the consolidation happens.
Done. Yeah.
Still think it's important you understand what a consolidation is, but you probably don't need 2 undergraduate courses. Exactly. So that frees up time now to do it. And so when we get to some of those foundational things, and this was a little bit controversial early on in our process, but we brought people along. We think it's important that new CPAs have a basic understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion, because that's the world in which we work.
Sure.
We think it's important they understand Canada's history with its Indigenous people. And the reason for that, those things are a perfect example I would cite was we did a round table with auditors general from across the country. And one of those auditor generals said that her office was doing a diversity audit. And I can't remember if it was a diversity audit of the government or of grant recipients, but there was some reference. And she said, I need CPAs because they understand how to do an audit. But if they have no knowledge of what diversity is, I don't need it.
Right.
So we're not saying everyone has to be an expert on EDI, but we're saying you have to understand that it's important in today's world and have a basic understanding. Similarly, we spent a lot of time with some Indigenous business leaders and working with Indigenous CPAs. And there are things that within an Indigenous culture around what is an asset and the like, is slightly different than we might have from our traditional standpoint. So again, we're not saying you have to be an expert, but you have to recognize a little bit about Canada's history with its Indigenous people. So those are some of the foundational things that would not appear anywhere, I would argue, in the old competency maps. But at the end of the day, we're still accountants. There's all these specific competencies that make us accountants. So we went from 160 pages, 180 competencies to about 25 pages and 35 competencies.
Oh, good for you. Simplified it. That's awesome. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, things like ESG, right? They got to be. ESG is in there. Absolutely. We've had another guest on the podcast that talked about ESG and the huge opportunity that exists there for accountants of the future, that it's not just about the quantitative data, the qualitative and how we assess some of these things. There's a huge opportunity there for the profession, which you're alluding to.
Exactly.
So, obviously Foresight impacted the work you did. We talked about some of those things that came out of Foresight. We talked a little bit about how the foundational principles set that up and it evolved some of the changes. What are the new skills and competencies that are needed for future CPAs today? So let's kind of break it back down and simplify it to that. How do you look at the skills and the competencies that are required?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, again, comes back to this sense of interpreting. And then what do you do with the data? And we had something called decision competencies, which is at a high level. If you look at the map, we say assessing a situation, deciding what needs to be done. So we've added words like critically evaluate, assess, and part of that is assessing what technology can be used and what and some of them are simple as recognizing when do I need to go get help from a more experienced CPA. So I think, but using data and that sense of understanding, analyzing data is critical, and I think is a large part of the new CPA. What we have to think about as CPAs. But to me, it's this sense of what am I going to do with the information I have, and how will I help someone make business decisions or make decisions myself? And then how will I use that to help plan for the future? And so, we went through a whole process of the decision competencies and all about using different verbs and saying, so we use design, identify, assess, determine, formulate, and then we sort of listed what's the level of proficiency of verbs. And I learned a ton about there's a whole nomenclature of verbs, and collaborate, to evaluate mean a much higher proficiency than describe or identify. And so what we've tried to do with the new map is say what verb, being very deliberate about what verb is applicable, and where we get into you need to have a deeper understanding or higher competencies are things like using, like you said, the need to use optimal technology and apply systems thinking is now at a level 4 out of 5. Then that probably didn't exist when you and I went through. Prioritizing risks and decision making, things like that. So, and that all fits into the broader rubric of assessing a situation, deciding what needs to be done, designing and planning an approach going forward, and then implementing an actual plan. And then we break it down with a whole bunch of decision or more specific competencies below that. And I know I'm sounding very vague, but to some extent that's a little bit on purpose, because the vagary is to allow for things to be changed quickly and adapt. And so there is work being done now to take this competency map and work with the post-secondary institutions to help them with curricula. So because at the end of the day, the post-secondary institutions and the students want to know, well, what do I need to know? Like, what do I literally need to know to pass the CFE today? And so that's part of the difficulty that this new group has, but now to take this competency map, which is, take this document and then say, okay, now how do we put in a framework that we can assess it and test it and teach to it?
Right. No, that's good. So, the technical, the analysis, the judgment, the ability to take the data and turn it into something of value, obviously that's a huge part of everything the profession will do going forward, and the competencies will be driven towards. Talk about just dealing with people.
Yeah.
And I always use that. You hear a lot of stereotypes all the time with accountants, and there's so many jokes thrown around about accountants. Like my favorite is always, when you talk to, how do you know the difference between an introverted and an extroverted accountant when you talk to them, right? And it's the introverted one looks at his shoes, the extroverted one looks at yours, right? So we hear everybody has these jokes, right? So as an accountant, I used to take them really personally. I don't anymore. But it's interesting because over the years, I've sort of looked at that and I sort of said, well, is that reality or is that a stereotype? And, but perception is reality. And so, the people, the travels that I've had with accountants, like I see lots of very emotionally intelligent accountants that do a fantastic job with people, but you also see a traditional stereotype every now and then. And so I guess what I would ask you is, do you think that is the people that are drawn to the profession? Or do you think it's the way that the people are trained in the profession that creates that?
I think there's a little bit of both, and I'm probably going to talk out both sides of my mouth. I think there's no question that for some people, they just like this. It's very clear. This is the structure. This is, I can say it's a debit or a credit or this, and they're drawn to the profession for that reason. And they were, they were happy to be the traditional boring accountant, and that's what they wanted to do. I think what's changing, and the reason we have to think about changing is, I think there are fewer and fewer of those people that you would define as young people coming through. Mm-hmm. And so that traditional accountant, there'll always be some, but I think it will be tougher and tougher to hire people if that's what we're offering them as a profession. And I remember one of the partners at one of the big accounting firms, as we were doing our work, he said, Tim, I'm not worried about this new map with the people that I'm trying to hire or trying to recruit. He says, what I'm worried about is my old partners. He said, it's very tough to teach old partners new tricks.
Right.
And I think that this is going to sound very unfair to folks that have been in accounting firms for a long time, but there was a path, I watched it when I went through, that there was a certain type of person who stayed in the firm, and then there was a type of person that left the firm. And the folks that left the firm were the ones that tended to be more forward thinking and didn't want to just deal with historical information. And those that were comfortable with that just stayed, and they became managers and the senior managers, principals, partners. And so I think there's an inevitable piece of the profession that has a large group of those folks in it. And that's not to suggest, I don't want your listeners to get upset and say I'm calling all of them folks that are just looking in the rearview mirror, because I know that's not the case, particularly with your audience who are working with a lot of smaller businesses or medium or growth businesses. But I think, so where I was going with that is that for to stay relevant and to hire and to keep people in the profession, we need to be doing this type of forward thinking work. So I think it's going to take care of itself a little bit, because I think as we evolve as a profession, we're then going to keep people and say, you can actually have a really interesting career in whether it's in a firm or whether it's in your own practice or whatever it might be. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question there. But
I think so. Really, in the end of it, I think if you've accomplished that through your competency map, maybe some of these jokes will disappear.
Well, yeah. I had the advantage because I went to the University of Waterloo, so we had an actuarial thing. So I used to say all the time, well, hey, as accountants, we're better than the actuaries because we actually have a sense of humor. So
there you go. So, anyways, we'll see. We'll maybe check in 5 or 10 years from now and see if that stereotype's changed and it's more about emotional intelligence and relationship management, because I think that is really got to be a core piece of the future of the profession. Is how are we getting to the heart of the matter issues? How are we having people open up and feel comfortable? Because without that, you can have all the data in the world and maybe have judgment, but you're not going to get really to the truth of what needs to be done. So I think that's an important part. And so talk about how the competency map and how the profession is changing to help accountants as they move forward with some of those human-centric skills the emotional intelligence, the things that they need to be able to use their judgment in the best way?
Yeah, I think that what we try to do is say that things like organizational behavior and understanding how humans behave is important. And I use the example. I've got a son who is a relatively recent CPA. He works in the accounting department at a tech company, a growing, good sized tech company, and he's responsible for the budget. And he was sharing with me last night that he's in negotiations with certain department heads around headcounts. And he said, my job is to say, no, they can't make this higher, can't do that higher, but it's a conversation. And so for him, he can't just be head down saying, this is my Excel spreadsheet says this is your budget. It's actually having the conversation with somebody and understanding what their needs are, understanding how humans how humans think. And so he is getting to understand that his role as a CPA requires him to manage people, to negotiate with people. And so that's why some of the things we put in the map around, understanding conflict management, understanding, how negotiations happen are key parts of the new competency map. Because if we are going to do more than simply say this data is correct, validate it, sort it, here it is, you now have to do something with it. And so I think you have to have those human elements. I think it's why you're going to see the map as it gets translated, for example, into the post-secondary institutions, more group work and group assignments, and recognition that you might be put in a group and forced to do some work at your university or college. Well, that's no different than the workforce. You don't get to pick your coworkers, right? You're put into an environment, so you've got to learn to deal with that. So I think that's a critical part of being a CPA, and will be even more critical going forward.
Yeah, perfect. And that's a big change, and will be important as it moves ahead. You mentioned earlier, we were talking about your process you went through to come up with the map, and looking at CPAs and meeting with CPAs, or looking at other competency maps around the world. How does where Canada lands compare to the AICPA? Like one of the interesting examples I've heard lately is in the AICPA, one of their competencies now includes personal financial planning. And I think they're trying to not just, drive it to the business side, but they're looking at how do we look at people more holistically with their planning. So just curious as to whether the AICPA sort of fed into what you did, or maybe you influenced them. I'm not sure where that kind of went. You can chat about that.
Sure, yeah, and I'm not an expert on their stuff, and we had an eye on it as they were going through the same thing. I will say that they, in our map, we started off very early and used the analogy of a tree, and actually, have a tree in the map, and this idea that you have sub-foundational competencies below the surface. You have this trunk with foundational competencies, and then specific and professional competencies being the branches and the leaves. And they then stole our visual and started using the tree. So what do they say? Flattery is
imitation is flattery.
Imitation the best form of flattery. So I don't know the specific ins and outs, but it sounds like they're on the same path as us, which I think is a good thing for consistency. The idea that the personal financial planning, I think that's actually a great point. We dealt with it at a not at a high level. It came up a few times. I will say it's not explicit in the map, but the way we've done the map can be brought in. And I actually think I will be surprised if that's not something that comes out of this. It's certification 2.0, because I do think that's a critical piece, and I think it's something more and more that we keep hearing. Financial literacy is a challenge. Financial planning for individuals is a challenge. So I think it makes sense that as CPAs that we have to have a basic understanding. I mean, everyone goes to what you and your CPA and says, what should I be investing in? How much should I be saving? There's just an assumption we know all these things. So I think it's good on them for actually including it. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, right? I think in the past, and are you familiar with, you must be, but the changes to Section 216, I think they, on referrals and commissions, that would have changed probably, I think, in Ontario in maybe 2016. I think it was right during the CPA merger. And that's sort of been rolled out across the provinces here. Maybe not a lot different than your process with Task Force, trying to get that done took a number of years. But it's an interesting one, right? Because it really opens up the ability for accountants to truly start to look at ways in which they can add value differently.
Yeah.
And that's not time-based and maybe not rear-view focused. Start to kind of lean into the wealth management world. I'm not sure, were those parts of the discussions as you went forward and you started to look at even how that professional standards has changed?
We didn't spend a lot of time on that, to be fair, and it certainly didn't specifically look at the 216 issues. But I think it's fair to say we looked at it in the context of this, again, what people are expecting CPAs to do. And to me, that's back to the planning and the advice. And, and I'm not an expert on it by any stretch, but it shouldn't surprise anyone that people are coming to CPAs and saying, can you help me and what should I do? Like anything, you go back to the ethical piece, and presumably there's the right balance of I'm providing advice and getting commissions or getting a fee over here, but I might also be asked to opine on I'm not talking about formal opinion, but provide advice more broadly and in terms of what someone's financial situation. And again, I'm not an expert, but I assume that those are the type of issues that they've been wrestling with. The problem is what's that right balance, I assume.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the balance between independence and professionalism and truly the value of helping clients more broadly and deepening those relationships. I know that 216 was likely changed because a lot of the leveling of the playing field with what the banks were doing and how they were moving into the accounting industry, and it just allows it to be more open source and really give clients the choice of how they want to be served and do that. So all of this is just interesting to me and how it's evolving so quickly here. It's exciting, and it's going to be interesting to see how the profession continues to move forward. You talked a lot. You mentioned earlier, I'll just ask this question. So, there's a lot of pieces to this. It's not just CPACanada going, okay, this is what this is going to look like, or a competency map where we start training and certifying. High schools, post-secondary, firms that are out there, they all have a role to play. And so in your view, how is that role changing? What do they need to be doing at those different levels to sort of make sure the outcomes are what we're hoping for as a profession?
Well, I think, broadly speaking, I think the profession needs to just be communicating about that CPAs are not just boring accountants dealing with historical information. And so there's that general perception. So that starts in high school, is how do we get people to say, I want to go and study accounting and also become a CPA? And I think one of the things that we're really proud of with the competency map was this idea that we think it allows post-secondary institutions to differentiate themselves. The existing map was so dense that the institutions, they had no room in their curricula to do anything other than teach exactly to those 180 competencies. And so now, going back to my example of consolidations, well, if we can pull out 2 consolidation courses, now they can offer something else. Right. And one of the things we heard from across the country was there are things that might be specific to a geography where that university or college wants to teach about the local industries. For example, if they get a lot of grads they're local, or a lot of students that are local that stay in the community, well, now they can bring some of that into the curricula. So I think that will be attractive to students from a post-secondary standpoint. And then as a profession, we've got to think about, the competency map said, what does a new CPA need to know to become a CPA? We didn't get into, so where do they need to learn it? Because they can learn it at post-secondary. They can learn it through on-the-job training, so internships, co-ops, and they can learn it, some stuff they can learn after starting work. And I think, we need to think as a profession about this lifelong learning. And how do we sort of say that the day you write the UFI is not the end of your journey in terms of learning. Yeah. That's just exactly, it's just the beginning of it. And I think, and that's going to require the individual to take some ownership. It's going to require the employer to take some ownership, and it's going to require the profession to provide some guidance and support to make that happen.
Yeah, so it's going to take everybody to do that for sure. Yeah. You told me a funny story in our discussions over the last little while about I don't know if it was you in a high school. Yeah, do you want to just tell that story?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Ontario had a program where you could go into, they would ask CPAs to go into high schools and talk about potentially trying to encourage people to go into into the accounting profession. I remember going into a school and I said, who here would like to be an accountant? And no hands went up. And I said, who here would like to be the profession or the president of a professional sports team? About half the hands went up. I said, who here would like to be the manager of one of the world's biggest music acts? And half the hands went up. And I said, well, today, Paul Beeston, this dates myself. I said, Paul Beeston, president of the Toronto Blue Jays, is a CPA. And I can't remember which artist it was. It was the manager of Madonna, for example, that she's a CPA. And so I said to the students, so you have this sense of what a CA at the time is, now a CPA is. But in fact, that it's a path to all these different careers. And now I get to stand up in front of the Shads when I'm traveling the country in the month of July. And they always say to me when I do a Q&A, they say, how do you end up as the CEO of Shad? And I say it started off because I studied accounting in high school and then in university, and that my CA is what has led me to this. And none of them think I'm an accountant. Like they're all surprised when they say, you're an accountant, but I take them through the journey. And to me, that's what I think we need to do more of is let young people understand that the CPA is a path to a whole bunch of opportunities.
Right. I love it. And, that's even part of this podcast. We call it the innovative accountant for a reason, right? Because they kind of don't necessarily, and I know I've had so many different accountants on this podcast that you just, it was a springboard for them, and they're doing so many interesting and creative things that to some degree don't have a lot to do with accounting anymore, but it was a foundation that set them off for such a bright future. So very, very great story. I love that. I'm going to use that in the future. It's good. So, and maybe I'll wrap on this note. If you were starting your career over today, okay, would you still become a CPA?
I absolutely would. And I go back to that small firm in Oakville. It's called Henderson Partners at the time, who just took a chance and said, yeah, we'll create a role for this person. And I got to see all these different types of businesses. And so I would. I think it's the greatest foundation that I could have. And I think today, I in my role at Shad, setting a path forward for this charitable organization, I'm looking at data and I'm thinking about data and I'm taking decisions or taking information and then making decisions. And it goes back to that great foundation I got through being a CPA.
No, that's awesome. I didn't expect an answer any different, but I thought I'd ask. And then I guess a spin-off to that, what would you do today to make the most out of your career in this evolving world? So as a CPA, if you're starting out today, maybe for those new CPAs, what would you choose to do?
I think you get involved in your community. And I always say to CPAs, you're sought after. Because every charity, every nonprofit, they're always looking for a treasurer, and they always default to us as treasurers. So you have an in with volunteering that a lot of people don't have. And my journey volunteering started because organizations like the food bank needed a treasurer. And so once you get into those organizations and they realize you then have more skills than just chairing the audit committee and dealing with the financial statements, then you start to have a broader role. But to me, that's the key, is that I think we as a profession have something to give back. It's tangible in terms of that we understand financials, we understand financial planning and the like, and I think we have a bit of an obligation to give back, as I said earlier, to support the leaders in our nonprofit communities who have made that decision. And I just think we have such a perfect in, because everyone always wants help from someone that has some financial expertise.
Yeah, no, and that's a perfect, I love that. That's exactly what we all need to be doing, is giving back. And so shifting gears a little bit here, I always ask the guests on my podcasts, and it goes back to my time with Strategic Coach, and we always had a breakout with the entrepreneurs on what everybody was reading, and there was always so much value that came from that. So I'll ask you the same question: is just what books have you read or are reading that you think all CPAs should read?
Yeah, my hobbies are poker and magic, so I love cards. And the book that I've been suggesting everyone read is it's called The Biggest Bluff. It's by Maria Konnikova, and she's written a couple other books, but she had never played poker. She decided she wanted to learn how to play poker, and her goal was to play in the World Series of Poker. And so she befriended a gentleman called Eric Seidel, who is a world-class poker player, and he took her from knowing nothing to where she ultimately won a significant poker tournament. But the book is about her journey of learning that, but it's about what she learned about herself. And I think there's a lesson in there for everybody. So it's an easy read. I'd encourage folks to try that. So The Biggest Bluff by Maria Konnikova.
Love it. I'm a poker fan as well as a Magic fan, so that's we have that in common. That's great.
Right.
I'll have to check it out. And then maybe one other little twist, because you are spending time with Shad with high school, and so is there a book that you think every high school student should read?
Yeah, that's a good question. I encourage both my boys to read Dave Chilton's The Wealthy Barber.
Okay.
And I think every young person should read that. I think the advice on that is as relevant today as when Dave wrote it. I think it's a great foundational understanding of thinking about your financial future, regardless of circumstance. And the book is entertaining as well. And so that would be the way. So The Wealthy Barber by Dave Chilton.
Yeah. Great choice. So much, the importance of financial literacy at that age, and
Absolutely.
changing a bit of that system and providing that is super important. So great suggestion. And maybe just as a conclusion, Tim, if our listeners want to learn more about the changes that are ongoing in the profession, CPA Canada or the like, what would you recommend for them? What is the best place for that? Where do they start? Where do they look?
Yeah. So there is a Foresight website through CPACanada. It has its own page on there. That's probably the best place to go. People are welcome to reach out to me if they either can't find it or they have specific questions, and I can direct them. They can get me at tim@shad.ca, shad.ca. Happy to point anyone in the right direction.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And this is more of a final selfish question for me, because I've got a high school student at my house. And so if parents want to learn more about the program at Shad, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so our website, shad.ca, is the best place. We just have closed our applications for summer 2023. We do the application process through the fall. Lots of information on there about both of our programs, our on-campus program, what we're calling Shad Anywhere. And again, if someone has a specific question, I'm more than happy to spend some time with them. But,
perfect.
Yeah, shad.ca.
Is that for grade 10, 11, 12, or how does that work?
It's the summer after grade 10 or after grade 11. The reason we don't do after grade 12 is that we're trying to open people's eyes to options. And so if you come after grade 12, you already know what you're going to do in the fall. So we want people to be able to change their trajectory, if it makes sense.
Got it. Perfect. Well, that's wonderful. And Tim, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time today and sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
I enjoyed it. Enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on, Tim.
Yeah, my real pleasure. Thanks again. I look forward to reconnecting with you as we have time. And that ends this edition of the Innovative Accountant Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Tim Jackson.
Thanks.
There we go, my friend. We did it.
All right. Yes, I apologize. I gave you horrible